Even as the stakes for succeeding in education get higher and higher every year, we're still choosing a mode of teaching that we know only works well for a minority of our children, and it's killing us. It's time to start talking about the most revolutionary option on the table: unleashing our superpower.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, approaches the effectiveness of tutoring.
It would be really hard to find an educational intervention that has the same rigorous research base and potential to improve student outcomes as tutoring does.
Tutoring, lots and lots of tutoring, that is going to put them way, way ahead.
Welcome to Tutoring the Human Superpower. I'm Giles Leeper. Recently, I was playing soccer in the backyard with my son, my daughter, and a few of their friends. And it was a hot day in Atlanta. So we got thirsty pretty fast. And when we came in to get a drink, something kind of bizarre happened. Della, my 8-year-old daughter, spilled a bunch of water on the rug. Everybody noticed it, and there was like a collective gasp. And then, and this is the bizarre part, she just shrugged and said, "I don't care," and then acted like nothing had happened. I'm a person who's read a lot of research on how to guide my children in these kinds of moments, prioritizing their learning and their emotional development. So how should I have responded in that moment? Well, that's not what I did. My immediate reaction was that clearly my own daughter did not care about our house, had no sense of personal responsibility for her own behavior, and so I got mad at her, scolded her harshly, right in front of her brother and her friends, and she ran out of the room crying. A little while later, my wife Christina pulls me aside. She's also seen this incident, and she explained to me how she interpreted what happened. Our daughter is not a person who normally refuses to take responsibility for her mistakes, and we both know that. And she does care about our house. But what my wife remembered was that those are not friends she feels particularly safe with. They've made fun of her in the past and teased her multiple times. So Christina was able to read the situation better than I was. She understood that Della had just been embarrassed by that big spill. She acted like it didn't bother her, but that was sort of like an evasive maneuver. She was anticipating that they were going to tease her about it for being clumsy or whatever. And when Christina explained that to me, then I saw it immediately. I knew, of course, that that's what had happened. And I felt terrible. I went off to apologize to Della because by scolding her in front of them, I had only made everything a whole lot worse. If I had immediately understood what Christina had, I could think of a whole bunch of better ways that I might have reacted in that moment. But I didn't understand. In that moment, I failed to see the world from my daughter's perspective. Most of the time, I do think that my wife is a bit better than me at the skill that we're going to be talking about today. And that skill is called mind reading. I became interested in mind reading because the psychologists who have shown that teaching is very likely a natural, evolved cognitive ability have focused on this sort of amazing fact that children very often use sophisticated mind reading abilities when they are tutoring. And they do this without knowing that they're doing it. And so this is how I began to wonder, what is mind reading? You know, in the psychologist sense, not the magician's sense. My guest today, Professor Ian Apperly, is an expert on mind reading. He is a professor at the University of Birmingham, in the UK that is, not Alabama, Birmingham. He's their director of the Center of Developmental Science. He is an experimental psychologist, and he's the author of a book called Mindreaders, the cognitive basis of theory of mind. I spoke with him to learn more about what mind reading really is. And of course, how does it interact with teaching and learning? Is mind reading something we have to try to do? Is it something we learn how to do, or is it cultural? Is it instinctive? Are we all equally good at it? Can it happen in large groups, or does it have to be more like a one-on-one kind of thing? These are some questions that Professor Ian Apperly has thought more deeply about than most. Thank you so much, Dr. Ian Apperly, for joining me today. You wrote a book called Mindreaders, The Cognitive Basis of Theory of Mind. In the most simple layman's terms, how could you explain what that title means?
I think the intuitive idea is very straightforward, which is that some people are more socially able than others. That it feels intuitively true that's the case. And that doesn't just boil down to intelligence. So if you cast your mind around your friends and colleagues, perhaps you might, if you work in an academic or similar environment, it's highly selective for intelligence, broadly speaking, but there's considerable variance, let's say, in people's social aptitude. And so I guess there's a very broad question about, well, what is it then that's varying between people that isn't simply intelligence? And I guess the thought is that certainly part of the answer to that question might come from our ability to think about other people's perspectives, other people's beliefs and desires and intentions.
So already I find this fascinating. Just this idea that mind reading skills, the ability to think about other people's beliefs and desires and intentions, are related to general intelligence, but they are not one and the same, and they're not necessarily always correlated. And why do you use the term mind reading to describe this skill?
I think the analogy with reading, actual text reading, is quite informative in that there is a sense in which we take information from observed behavior and people's facial expressions and stuff. Just like you have to take visual information and integrate it with some knowledge about how letters relate to sounds in order to read. But for text reading, you have to do more than that, right? Not all the meaning comes from that. You have to do loads of integration of context and background information in order to actually figure out what the meaning of the text might be. And I think mind reading is really similar. So you don't read off what someone's thinking just by looking really hard at their face, or at least not for anything interesting.
Well, actually, that's exactly what I did with my daughter when she spilled that water. Basically, the problem was that I was just looking at her facial expression. She acted like she didn't care, and so I took her at face value. I didn't use my background knowledge, context clues to actually understand what was going on. I really love this analogy between mind reading and book reading. Both of these kinds of reading involve bringing together lots of different skills, but neither one is entirely correlated with intelligence. Dyslexic people can have average or above average intelligence, but still struggle with decoding words. And meanwhile, some otherwise neurotypical people don't know how to decode facial expressions or other emotional signals. Are we all equally good at mind reading? And if not, how can you measure that? How can you tell?
We've done some work with patients who've had a brain injury, strokes, for example, or alternatively in young children who perhaps haven't developed these abilities. A lot of research has originated with some really surprising findings that you see with children. It's surprising to psychologists, maybe not to parents. So you can ask young children, you tell them sort of simple stories which set up a difference in perspective between the child themselves and a character in a story. So one classic version, there's a character called Maxie who hides his chocolate in the green cupboard in the kitchen and then goes outside to play. And while he's outside to play, his mum moves it for some reason, so now it's in the red cupboard. So Maxie put it in the green cupboard, his mum's moved it to the red cupboard. And then the critical question would be, well, when Maxie comes back, he wants to find his chocolate, where will he first go and look to find it? And if you've kept up, then the answer obviously is that he'll look in the green cupboard where he first put it, because that's where he thinks it is. The striking finding is that many 3-year-olds, the majority of 3-year-olds, will say that he'll look in the red cupboard. They make an error that suggests that they're struggling to imagine, or at least to keep track of, or at least to acknowledge that his perspective is different from their own. Yeah. If you like, egocentric in a technical sense, not in the selfish sort of sense. 3-year-olds are prone to that kind of error, and by around 5, pretty consistently don't make that error any longer.
what Ian is talking about there is a version of what is commonly called the Sally Ann test. And versions of it have not only stumped 3-year-olds, but also people who have had strokes or other injuries to very specific regions of the brain, regions that control mind reading. Also, sometimes people with very specific types of intellectual disabilities can fail versions of this test while still having a very high IQ. Is mind reading automatic, or is this something we have to think about doing? Or is there maybe some nuance there, like for different kinds of mind reading?
Yeah, so there is some nuance there. So in the case of mind reading, you would hope that the jury in a court of law would be spending a good amount of time and effort contemplating the guilt or innocence of the dog. And why is that relevant to mind reading? Because, for example, whether the person intended to do things the way they did is the difference between manslaughter, for example. And those are high stakes decisions where you think you really want the person to be thinking about it. So an example of where mind reading might become more automatic is cases where you've practiced a lot or where the circumstances are very, very familiar, such as perhaps making small talk, perhaps saying thank you when someone performs a service like opening a door or giving you a ticket for something, which maybe at some point certainly serves a social purpose, and you could analyze it in terms of you say that in order to be polite because you want the other person to see that you're a nice person yourself and blah, blah, blah. But that's almost certainly not what it is that you're actually doing in those circumstances. And so that's an example of where maybe it's a process that originally required some sort of perspective taking, but it becomes automatic over time. So automaticity is not magic. It always comes at the cost of flexibility.
Okay. So there's a trade-off between speed and flexibility.
Yeah, that's almost a basic law. You don't get things that are extremely fast and also extremely flexible. You might have a process that does some of this perspective taking quite automatically, but it's really limited to relatively simple cases.
This point about automaticity versus flexibility is actually a really important one that once again reminds me of my failure to see my daughter's perspective and to recognize her embarrassment. I think it's really easy to fall into automatic mind reading as parents. Child misbehaved. The child is feeling mischievous. The child must be reprimanded. It was only with time and reflection and feedback from Christina that I was able to think more flexibly about my daughter saying, I don't care. I still want her not to think that making a mess without cleaning it is okay. But after taking the time to really consider the incident from my daughter's perspective, I could see that there was more nuance to it. I was able to think more flexibly about what had happened, less automatically. Does effort play a role in mind reading as well?
Yeah. What often accounts for differences in performance is especially in adults, is motivation rather.
Yeah.
And social motivation is something else that we can measure as psychologists. But if our interest is in mind reading, I think it is useful to distinguish between can you do this versus can you be bothered to do this?
Yeah. So just to quickly recap, mind reading is a very important skill that is separate from general intelligence, although the two do have impact on each other. Our skill with mind reading impacts every aspect of our lives. But mind reading skills can be impacted by brain injuries, by brain disabilities, and a person's age. It's also affected by the time we have for it, as well as the effort we're willing to put into it. Is mind reading unique to humans, or can animals also read minds?
The kinds of tasks that I've just described that 3-year-olds find difficult, there's very limited evidence that a non-human species can pass those tasks. And people have tried very, very hard to demonstrate that. There is some tentative evidence, but it's a cutting-edge topic. It's been a cutting-edge topic for quite a long time. People have been trying very hard. There is some evidence that of perhaps some limited abilities, but basically it really does look like it's something that even a very social species such as bonobos find extremely difficult to do. There's quite strong evidence that there's a difference in this understanding of other people having a different perspective, that someone else can have a different belief from you.
And why might that difference between humans and even our closest relatives, like bonobos, be important? I've noticed that it comes up a lot in anthropologist literature and evolutionary psychologist literature. Like, why do evolutionary psychologists seem to talk about that and care about human mind reading?
So why do the evolutionary psychologists care about that? Because if you're trying to explain things like cumulative culture,
Right.
so is that you build on previous innovations in order to develop more and more sophisticated technologies, for example, that depends, among other things, it depends very heavily on learning from other people. You certainly can learn from other people without being able to take their perspectives. But as a teacher, you might think it surely is an advantage if I can put myself in the shoes of the learner who doesn't yet know
Right.
what I'm trying to teach them, and not just demonstrate the right way of doing it, but to imagine what it might be like to not understand it yet, and to think what steps might be valuable to get you towards that understanding, for example. So quite often, the ability to understand about whether people have a genuinely alternative view on the same thing, if you like. So like in the false belief task, Maxie thinks his chocolate's in one cupboard and we know it's in the other cupboard. In lots of ways, it's a formally more sophisticated thing than just following somebody's eye gaze, for example. Yeah. And if you lack that, then you might think, well, it might be difficult to teach somebody, or to see that there is even any purpose in teaching something to somebody. Or if you wanted to teach somebody, then to figure out what it is that you might be trying to teach them. So, chimpanzees famously dip for ants, but they don't develop iPhones.
Mind reading probably did not evolve so that we could teach one another. It has many other purposes, but it has been identified as something that would have been very useful a long time ago in teaching. And teaching is a vital part of cumulative culture. Cumulative culture is something that all human communities have. It's our ability to basically remember important skills and knowledge learned by prior generations, even by passing it down. Over time, these lessons accumulate and create more and more complex and sophisticated social innovations and technological inventions. The iPhone is just one example of cumulative culture. If we couldn't teach, we wouldn't have iPhones. And if we couldn't read minds, teaching would either be impossible or just a lot worse. And that connection, of course, brings the conversation right back to education, which is, of course, my initial interest in mind reading. I do see how mind reading is relevant to teaching, especially complex things that need to be broken down into steps, like you said. But one question I wanted to ask you is this: is mind reading equally applicable to the kind of learning and teaching we do in our schools today, or what I call classroom teaching, as it is to the tutoring context? And by that, I don't mean necessarily academics. It could be like teaching somebody how to hunt with spears. Is the kind of mind reading that a teacher can do when they're tutoring the same kind of mind reading that they can do in classroom teaching, or is there some kind of difference?
So if you're thinking about a group of people rather than an individual, it clearly fairly quickly becomes very, very difficult to keep track of what the individualized information might be. I think the practice of teaching in groups, larger groups, more or less forces you to think of your students as a group for at least part of the time. And because you're having to deal with the things that can usefully generalize for that group of students, rather than trying to track them each as individuals. I'm sure if you speak to teachers, and I imagine you've done this more than me, they'll say they clearly do know each child and that they do keep track. But on the micro level, in terms of their understanding of an individual problem at a particular point in time, that's clearly impossible to do if you've got 30 children in front of you. You just can't at that level. So I think there is something distinctive in the kind of, I guess, the loop of trying to explain something, hearing someone, or seeing someone trying to enact that, or hearing someone asking questions about that, and building a sort of model between you of what's understood and what isn't understood, that just doesn't generalize very well outside of very small numbers. What you would want to do is, in a lab, is say, how many perspectives can you track simultaneously? If you boil it down to something dry and laboratory-like. And my guess is that number is relatively small. We actually have tried to do some work on that. So sort of nerdy work on attention in humans shows that you can track a very small number of objects as unique individuals. And so if you imagine dots moving around on the screen, you can only keep track of 3 or 4 around on the screen. And you can attach properties to those. So you can care about what color they might be and what shape they might be. But actually keeping track of more than 3 or 4 unique individuals is jolly difficult.
That is interesting because the research on tutoring shows that tutoring 3 students is just as effective as one-on-one.
Yeah.
And 4 is maybe. It depends. It's a little more wishy-washy. 5, not really. 6 is just not tutoring. It's just group thinking. And so for me, that's a really interesting connection.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to push it too hard, but it's an intriguing one because that ability to keep track of around 3 things, there's a surprising convergence on this. There's something about around 3, maybe 4, and it's actually 3, maybe 4. Sometimes it's not entirely clear. It's jolly hard to keep track of more than 3 or 4 things.
Mind reading is clearly a big part of scaffolding, which I covered in episode 2 of this podcast. And so it's a big part of tutoring. And researchers who know that often expect mind reading to be a big part of all kinds of teaching. But there's actually some pretty solid evidence that it's not actually a very big part of the kind of teaching that goes on in most classrooms. In 2023, there was a study by Barazza and Rodriguez that compared teachers to non-teachers on mind reading skills. They expected to find that classroom teachers would have stronger mind reading skills than regular people because they get to use their mind reading skills so much. They have practice, but what they actually found was the opposite. Classroom teachers, on average, had measurably worse mind reading skills than non-teachers. Not by much, but they were slower to pick up on emotional cues than non-teachers. Some other cognitive skills that they measured were higher for teachers, things like working memory and efficiency with tasks, but not on mind reading. They found this puzzling. To me, having been a tutor and a classroom teacher, it makes perfect sense. If you are constantly focused on understanding the perspectives of each of the children in your classroom, it will drive you completely bananas. Look, there's a child who looks sleepy. Or is she maybe bored during the lesson I'm giving right now? How is this lesson going from her perspective? Or maybe she's confused and she's just acting bored. I wonder which part of what I said might have confused her. Oh, and what are the other 20 kids thinking? If all of that is going through your mind while you're trying to teach a classroom, I'm sorry, but you are a bad teacher. You have to develop automaticity as a teacher. You have to do things fast. And you have to shut out nagging questions about, is what I'm doing the very best from the perspective of each individual child? Because usually it's not, which is something you got to learn to live with. I think if you really expect teachers to get better at mind reading than regular people, try giving them 3, maybe 4 learners. But of course, the effectiveness of tutoring is not all about the teacher and what's going through the teacher's mind. One study, for example, showed that children who were tutored, either individually or in groups of 3, were able to pay attention to the teacher and focus on the learning 90% of the time. But children who were taught the exact same content in a regular classroom could only focus on the learning with 60% of their time. To me, that would indicate that maybe those students are less engaged in mind reading during classroom teaching. Does the quality of the student's mind reading also matter during the teaching and learning process?
Yes, I think learning is an interactive process. And if you can be sensitive to your teacher, as it were, and I don't mean being nice to them, being able to see where they might be able to help you, then you might be able to get more out of them as a learner than you would do otherwise. And that is essentially about perspective taking.
I just have one last question. The popular mainstream culture is always behind the experts in a certain field, right? If there was one thing that has come to light, maybe in the last 20 years, something that you wish was more widely understood in the general population that's come out of your field, what would that be?
Wow, good question. I think, yeah, no, okay. So, I'm tempted to answer it negatively, which is to say we don't understand this as well as people often assume that we do.
Yeah.
So I think we have quite a good understanding of children, and in relation to neurodevelopmental conditions and especially autism, there's quite a lot of popular understanding now that there may be differences in social understanding or social ability, but that has also sometimes been unfortunately presented as, for example, autistic people lacking empathy. And it's not at all clear that is true. And there are lots of very articulate autistic adults saying, this is grossly offensive. I greatly care what people think, but I find it hard to figure it out sometimes. And there's a really interesting line of thinking coming out of the sort of self-advocacy work by autistic adults saying, well, actually, this isn't just about me not understanding other people. It's that I don't feel understood.
Yeah.
And I feel quite well understood by other autistic adults. And so I think that is changing, but I think that's a case where actually almost the research literature in my world, where social ability and neurodiversity are interacting, it's a case where actually almost the world is coming back and saying, actually, this hasn't necessarily done us the service that you should have done us, but there's something that's amiss in some of the way that some of the research is being presented and understood. If you go back to the research literature, that doesn't always tell the simple story that has then become popularly understood. But I think sometimes us as scientists have been complicit in telling a good story. And so, yeah, I think that's something where I think there's scientific work to be done, but the future lies in trying to make sure that it is doing more justice to people's experience of social understanding as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not the nice neat answer you might have been.
No, it does highlight the importance of your work, trying to figure these things out so that we get to those nuances and start to support people in the right way, as well as communicate in the right way about what people's struggles might actually be. And I don't know how often you get thanked, but so thank you for your work. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to talk with someone who's obviously thinking about lots of this stuff from a different perspective, but also who clearly has read around this literature as well. So it's really interesting.
At the end of these interviews, I always try to offer my own 2 cents about what we've learned from our expert and how does it relate to the central problem of this podcast, which of course is what would it take to unleash our superpower? Well, I think it's pretty clear that our superpower, which is of course our exceptional ability to learn from tutoring and to tutor others, is deeply connected with our ability to mind read. And mind reading itself is a superpower. It's a fascinating and awe-inspiring ability that we have to a level that no other animal even comes close to. We might take it for granted on a daily basis, especially if we are good at it. But if you stop and think about what humanity would be like if we didn't have this ability, it begins to almost feel like magic. And from this conversation with Professor Ian Apperly, I think it's pretty clear that we're not harnessing mind reading in our public schools to the fullest extent possible, just because of how we structure teaching and learning. And as I said, the study comparing mind reading abilities in teachers and non-teachers showed that our teachers are not really practicing mind reading on a day-to-day basis any more than the rest of us. If anything, they have worse mind reading skills than non-teachers. There's just a limit to the number of individual minds that we can track all at once before we shift away from mind reading and into groupthink, thinking about people as members of a group instead of as individuals, which is an entire different branch of psychology. So I could say now that in order to unleash our superpower, we're going to need to bring mind reading back into the center of education, where it originally was. When mind reading is a really important part of learning, people learn more. But if I'm honest, that's what I already thought before I spoke with Ian. What really shifted my thinking was actually more to do with one of the last things he said, and it had very little to do with academic learning. It was about people with autism feeling misunderstood. Misunderstandings are basically failures in mind reading. Failures to take a perspective. It's a failure to see the world through another person's eyes. When I approached my daughter Della to apologize to her, she was so mad at me. She refused to let me put my arm around her. But when I told her that I understood the reason that she had done what she did, she immediately threw herself into my arms and hugged me tightly. I think maybe even it allowed her to understand why she had done what she did. I honestly think that her knowing that I was sorry was not as important as her knowing that I understood her. Failure to understand is a huge problem that goes beyond people with autism. People on the left side of the political spectrum don't feel very understood by people on the right, and the reverse is also true. People who are neurodivergent feel misunderstood. People with different religions, different sexual preferences, different races. And yes, one contribution to all that can be poor communication about the actual science, which is what he was talking about. That's Ian's job. But as educators and as community members, I think we could do better too. Many of us have long hoped that public schools would become places where we learn to understand people who are different from us. But when we teach kids in large groups, we don't put teachers or students in a position that's really good for that. Growing up, I sat in rooms with children who had autism. But sitting in a room with 30 people, including people with autism, didn't really give me a chance to understand those people or see the world through their eyes. And the same is true of the children who had different political beliefs from my own. Sure, when we would pick our friends, we did have the opportunity to dive deeper and to really understand other people. But when we do that, we normally tend to pick people who are just a lot like us already. And many of us don't even go to schools with people who are all that different from us. Highly educated people generally prefer to send their kids to schools with the children of other highly educated people, for example. So we miss out on one of the great opportunities of public schooling, which is the chance to deeply understand people, to view the world through perspectives that are different from our own. I know that I have a tendency to focus too much on academic learning that can take place from tutoring, which is one of its important benefits. But thanks to this conversation, I think that to unleash our superpower would require us to think really intentionally about the opportunity to really understand one another that came from just spending more time in groups that are small enough for mind reading to really take place. Teacher-student mind reading, student-student mind reading, all of that can happen more often in groups of 3 and maybe 4 other people. Also, if we were to learn more in groups of 3 and 4, then we might be willing to send our kids to schools with kids who are very different from ours. We'd know that they were safe and their needs were being met. We might even be willing to buy houses and neighborhoods with people that are different from us. To unleash our superpower would be to transform our schools into institutions of mind reading, perspective taking, and seeing the world through other people's eyes. As always, thanks for listening, and you can reach me at gilesleeper.com.